I never expected to be humiliated at my own sister's engagement party. The lights were warm, the smiles were rehearsed, and Sarah's voice carried easily across the room when she laughed and told a group of investors that I was just a struggling freelancer who did little tech odd jobs. People chuckled. Someone clinked a glass. My chest burned, but I stayed quiet, just like I always did. Then her fiancé, Julian, turned toward me, studying my face like he was trying to solve a high-stakes puzzle. "Wait," he asked, his voice dropping an octave. "What is the name of your company exactly?" I didn't explain. I didn't defend myself. I said one word. And what happened next wasn't loud or messy, but it changed how my family looked at me forever. Please do us a favor by subscribing to this channel. My name is Lydia Moore. For as long as I can remember, my family has loved neat labels. The kind you can say quickly at dinner parties to avoid follow-up questions. My sister Sarah was always the impressive one, ambitious, charismatic, the kind of person who could walk into a room and make it orbit around her. And me? I was the quiet one. The unreliable freelancer. That label followed me everywhere, to Thanksgiving tables, birthday dinners, and awkward phone calls with relatives. "Are you still doing those little tech projects, dear?" they'd ask, smiling like they were being kind. I'd just nod and let the conversation move on. What they didn't see was how carefully I had learned to stay invisible. I wasn't ashamed. I was a data prodigy, a ghost architect who worked in the shadows for firms that didn't even exist on the public web. I earned in an hour what Sarah earned in a month, but I learned early on that my accomplishments made my family uncomfortable. Especially Sarah. So, I softened my words. I rounded the edges of my life and let them believe the smaller version of me because it kept the peace. I didn't realize that by staying quiet, I wasn't protecting them, I was just teaching them how small they could make me. But tonight, Sarah's fiancé wasn't looking at the smaller Lydia. He was looking at the woman who held the encryption keys to his entire empire. And he was about to realize that the person Sarah called a failure was the only reason he was still a millionaire. For as long as I can remember, my family has been obsessed with the efficiency of neat labels. They treat people like files in a poorly managed directory. Once you've been tagged, the system never bothers to rescan for updates. My sister Sarah was always the impressive one. She was the charismatic orbit around which our parents' pride revolved, the kind of person whose every milestone was narrated with the hushed reverence of a royal decree. And then there was me. I was the quiet one. Over time, that evolved into a more condescending tag, the struggling freelancer. These labels were convenient. They were the kind of descriptors you could toss across a dinner table to shut down a conversation before it even started. "Oh, Lydia's just doing her little tech projects," my mother would say with a tight, sympathetic smile when a relative asked what I was up to. It was a verbal pat on the head, a way to signal that I was safe, unthreatening, and most importantly, beneath their notice. I'd learned early on that in the Moore household, there was only room for one star, and Sarah had claimed that spotlight before she even graduated high school. I remember sitting through countless dinners where the air was thick with the scent of roasted turkey and Sarah's ego. My parents would lean in, their faces glowing with reflected glory, as she talked about her latest promotion or her high-profile networking events. When the spotlight finally, begrudgingly, flickered toward me, the atmosphere changed. Forks scraped against china, and my father would suddenly find his wine glass very interesting. "Still doing that freelance stuff, honey? Must be hard not having a real salary," he'd ask, not really wanting an answer. I'd just nod. "Yeah, Dad." Still at it. What they didn't see, what they refused to see, was the woman I became once I stepped out of their cramped, narrow-minded world. They saw a 27-year-old in a worn hoodie who worked from her kitchen table. They didn't see the ghost architect who navigated the dark corridors of international finance. They didn't see the lines of code I wrote that served as the digital armor for firms like the one Sarah's fiancé, Julian, struggled to manage. To them, if it wasn't a title they could brag about at the country club, it didn't exist. I let them believe the lie because the truth made them uncomfortable. I had tried once or twice to explain the complexity of a decentralized security audit I'd performed for a major firm, but their eyes would glaze over within seconds. Sarah would laugh and say, "Lydia, don't bore everyone with your computer talk." So I learned to soften my words. I rounded the edges of my life to fit the small, dusty box they'd built for me. I let Sarah be the ambitious one because it kept the peace, and for a long time, I told myself that their validation didn't matter. But standing in the middle of this engagement party, surrounded by warm lights and rehearsed smiles, the label felt like a chokehold. Sarah was gliding through the crowd, her diamond catching the light like a predator's tooth, and every time she introduced me as her little sister who does odd jobs, a quiet, heavy heat began to settle in my chest. I had spent years shrinking to make them feel big, editing my own success to avoid bruising Sarah's fragile vanity. As I watched my parents beam at Julian, I realized I was tired of being the background noise in my own life. The quiet one had stayed silent for 10 years, not out of shame, but out of a misplaced sense of loyalty. I looked at Julian, who was currently being lectured by my father on business ethics, and I saw the moment his eyes drifted toward me, the moment the neat label they'd given me was about to be shredded by the one person in the room who actually knew what I was worth. I didn't need to shout to be heard. I just needed to stop pretending that the small version of me was the only one that existed. The lie had kept the peace for a decade, but as Sarah laughed and called me just a freelancer, I knew the peace was over. The system was finally running an update, and the Moore family wasn't ready for the results. In the silence of my home office, lit only by the rhythmic glow of 3 curved monitors, I wasn't Lydia, the struggling freelancer. I was the ghost architect. To my family, a computer was a tool for social media and online shopping, but to me, it was a sprawling, infinite landscape of architecture and war. I dealt in the invisible, the lines of code that kept global commerce from collapsing, and the digital vaults that stored the world's most dangerous secrets. My real career started when I was 19. While Sarah was busy being the president of her sorority and perfecting the art of the impressive handshake, I was discovering a backdoor in a major banking encryption protocol. I didn't exploit it. I patched it and sent the solution to the bank CTO with a digital signature that could never be traced back to a suburban girl in a Moore family sweater. That was the birth of Aegis Digital. It wasn't a company with a glass-fronted office or a flashy HR department. It was a phantom entity, a high-level cybersecurity consultancy that existed entirely in the encrypted layers of the web. I chose to stay invisible for 2 reasons. The first was professional. In my world, anonymity is the ultimate currency. If the hackers don't know who you are, they can't find your weaknesses. But the second reason was far more personal. It was the Moore tax. In our family, any success was immediately measured against Sarah's. If I had told them I was making 7 figures by the age of 24, my parents wouldn't have been proud, they would have been panicked. They had invested everything, emotionally and financially, into Sarah being the golden child. My success wouldn't have been a victory for the family. It would have been an anomaly that threatened the hierarchy they had spent decades building. I remember a specific night, 3 years ago, when I was in the middle of a high-stakes live-fire drill. A multinational conglomerate was under a massive ransomware attack, and I was the only person on the planet with the decryption keys to save their servers. My phone had buzzed. It was my mother, calling to ask if I could come over and help Sarah set up her new smart TV. "I'm a little busy right now, Mom," I had whispered, my fingers flying across the keys as I blocked a malicious IP address from Eastern Europe. "Doing what, dear?" "More of those little graphics for that local shop." Her voice had been thin with patronizing patience. "Sarah really needs this done before her dinner party. It'll only take an hour. Try to be a team player for once." I had looked at my screen, where $40 million in assets were being recovered because of my intervention, and then at the phone. "I can't make it, Mom." She had sighed, that long, disappointed exhale that was meant to make me feel 2 inches tall. "Well, I suppose we can't all have Sarah's work ethic." I had hung up and gone back to saving a Fortune 500 company. The irony was a cold weight in my chest. I was the person these CEOs called when their world was burning, the one they paid exorbitant retainers just to keep on speed dial. I was the ghost, because it was easier to be a ghost than to be a threat to my sister's ego. I had built a digital empire from a desk they thought was for hobbies, and I had done it while they were busy laughing at my lack of a real job. Staying invisible became a game of survival. Every time I bought a new piece of high-end hardware, I hid it in a nondescript cabinet. Every time I won a major contract, I celebrated alone with a glass of expensive scotch that I tucked away before Sarah could come over and ask why I was wasting money. I let them believe the smaller version of me because the real Lydia was too big for their narrow world to hold. But tonight, at the engagement party, as I watched Julian, a man whose entire corporate infrastructure I had personally rebuilt after a catastrophic breach last year, I realized the ghost was tired of haunting her own life. Julian didn't know the face of the woman who saved him, but he knew my digital signature. He knew the name Aegis. And as he looked at me with a growing, haunting sense of recognition, I realized that the smaller version of Lydia Moore was about to be overwritten by the architect. The peace I had bought with my silence was about to be the first casualty of the truth. The ballroom of the Grand Pierre was a sea of shimmering silk and practiced laughter, the air heavy with the scent of expensive lilies and the underlying hum of social climbing. As the catering staff began to circulate with vintage champagne, my sister Sarah took her place at the center of the room. She was the picture of a modern success story, a vision in white lace, her eyes sparkling with the cold triumph of a woman who had finally secured the ultimate accessory, Julian. My parents sat in the front row, their faces radiating a desperate, borrowed pride that they never quite managed to find when looking at me. Sarah tapped her glass, the silver chime cutting through the chatter like a knife. "I won't take up too much of your time," she began, her voice projecting that effortless charisma she had cultivated since she was a child. "But standing here tonight with Julian, looking out at all of you, I'm reminded of how far ambition can take you. I've always believed that you are the sum of your choices, the result of your drive to be more than just ordinary." She paused, letting the word ordinary hang in the air for a second too long. Her gaze drifted toward the corner where I stood, tucked away near the shadows of the bar. It was a subtle movement, but I felt the weight of it, the familiar, sharp edge of her need to use me as the floor for her to stand on. "I've been lucky," Sarah continued, a playful smile playing on her lips. "I grew up in a house where we were encouraged to dream big. And while some of us chose to take the safe path, the quiet, comfortable life where the stakes are low and the freelance hours are flexible, I knew I wanted more. I wanted to build something real. Something that mattered." A few people chuckled, their eyes following Sarah's pointed glance toward me. My mother leaned over and whispered something to my father, who nodded with a sympathetic, almost pained expression. The quiet one was being used once again as the cautionary tale, the example of what happens when you lack the fire to burn bright. "Julian and I are building a legacy," she said, her hand moving to rest on his shoulder. He looked stiff, his posture rigid, his eyes fixed on me with a strange, haunting intensity that Sarah was too self-absorbed to notice. "We understand that in the real world, you don't just dabble in things. You commit. You innovate. You don't just hide behind a screen, you lead." The condescension was thick enough to choke on. She wasn't just celebrating her engagement, she was performing a public audit of my life and declaring it bankrupt. She was telling every investor and CEO in this room that I was a non-entity, a girl who played with computers while the adults handled the actual business of the world. It was a masterclass in passive-aggressive erasure, delivered with a smile and a glass of bubbly. "So, here's to the risk-takers," Sarah concluded, raising her glass high. "To the ones who aren't afraid of the spotlight, and to the ones who actually have something to show for their work." The room erupted in applause, a wave of approval for the golden child. Sarah basked in it, her head held high, looking every bit the victor. She looked at me one last time, a glimmer of pity in her eyes that was far more insulting than outright hatred. She thought she had won. She thought she had successfully framed the narrative for the rest of our lives. But as the applause died down, I noticed Julian wasn't clapping. He was staring at my hands, which were resting calmly on the edge of a mahogany table. He was staring at the way I didn't flinch, the way I didn't look down in shame. I could see the gears turning behind his eyes, the digital memory of a frantic night 6 months ago when a voice, distorted and anonymous, had guided him through the wreckage of his company's servers. The air in the ballroom felt suddenly thin, charged with a static electricity that Sarah was completely oblivious to. She had just spent 5 minutes mocking the freelancer who hid behind a screen, never realizing that the man she was about to marry owed his entire reputation to that very woman. The ambitious one had just finished her performance, but the architect was finally ready to take the stage. And unlike Sarah's rehearsed speech, my intervention wouldn't require a microphone to be heard. The toast ended, but the silence that followed felt heavy, like the static before a lightning strike. Sarah was still beaming, basking in the warmth of the applause, her hand possessively entwined with Julian's arm. She looked like a queen who had just successfully banished a peasant from her court. My parents were already turning back to their appetizers, their duty to acknowledge the quiet one fulfilled for another year. But Julian didn't move. He didn't reach for his glass to join the toast. His eyes were locked on mine, narrowed with a focus that was sharp enough to cut through the room's expensive perfume. He looked like a man staring at a ghost or a miracle. "Lydia," he said, his voice cutting through the ambient chatter. It wasn't the patronizing tone my father used, or the sugary sweet condescension of my sister. It was a voice of pure, unadulterated curiosity. "Sarah mentioned you do freelance tech work. That's a broad field. What's the name of the outfit you run?" The table went quiet. Sarah let out a sharp, tinkling laugh that sounded like breaking glass. "Oh, Julian, honey, don't put her on the spot. It's just a little home-based thing. It doesn't even have a proper office. She probably doesn't even have business cards, DULYDES." My mother gave me a look that pleaded for me to just nod and let it go, to stay in the smaller version of myself for just one more night. I felt the familiar urge to round the edges, to say something vague like LM Consulting or just local support. I saw the trap Sarah had set, another opportunity for her to sigh and explain that I was adorable for trying. I looked at Julian. I saw the stress lines around his eyes that hadn't been there a year ago. I remembered the 3 a.m. voice calls, the sound of his ragged breathing as he watched his company's stock price plummet during the breach, and the way he had begged me, an anonymous voice on an encrypted line, to save his life's work. I didn't blink. I didn't look at Sarah. I didn't look at my parents. "Aegis," I said. The word was a single syllable, but it landed with the weight of a sledgehammer. The air seemed to leave Julian's lungs in a sudden, sharp hiss. His face didn't just pale, it turned the color of ash. He dropped his hand from Sarah's arm as if she had suddenly turned into cold marble. "Aegis," he repeated, his voice barely a whisper. "Aegis Digital? Based out of an encrypted node in Northern Europe." "That's the one," I replied, my voice cool and steady as a mountain stream. "We specialize in invisible architecture, patching the holes that the big firms are too slow to find." Sarah looked between us, her smile flickering like a dying bulb. "Aegis? That sounds like a security company." "Lydia, stop being weird. You told us you did web design for that bakery down the street." Julian wasn't listening to her. He stepped forward, ignoring the wine glass that tipped over on the white linen tablecloth, sending a crimson stain spreading toward my mother's lap. He was staring at my hands again, the hands of the person who had spent 72 hours straight rebuilding his servers while he wept in his office. "The breach last October," Julian said, his eyes searching mine with a terrifying intensity. "The consultant we hired, the one who refused to meet in person. The one the board called the ghost. They said her signature was a stylized embedded in the kernel code." "It's a digital watermark," I said simply. It ensures the patch can't be overwritten by the original exploit. The room was now utterly silent. The quiet one was gone. In her place stood the architect, and the power dynamic in the room was shifting so violently it was almost physical. My father's jaw had dropped, and my mother was clutching her pearls so hard the string looked ready to snap. "You!" Julian gasped, his eyes wide with a mix of awe and sheer terror. "You're the one?" I paid a $2 million retainer to a woman my fiancé calls a struggling freelancer. I looked at Sarah. She was frozen, her face a mask of confusion that was slowly curdling into horror. She had spent a lifetime building a pedestal out of my supposed failures, never realizing she was standing on a foundation I had built for her. "Labels are funny things, Julian," I said, finally letting a small, cold smile touch my lips. "They're usually for the benefit of the people who apply them, not the people who wear them." I picked up my glass and took a slow, deliberate sip of the expensive champagne Sarah had bought with the money she'd earned at a firm I had saved from bankruptcy. The one word had been spoken. The lie was dead. And as Julian stared at me in total silence, I realized that for the first time in 27 years, no one in this room was going to tell me who I was. The crimson wine continued its slow, rhythmic drip from the edge of the table, but no one moved to clean it. The ballroom, once filled with the vapid music of social climbing, had become a vacuum. Sarah stood frozen, her hand still shaped as if she were holding Julian's arm, though he had physically recoiled from her. She looked at him, then at me, her eyes darting like a trapped animal's. "Julian, you're confused," Sarah said, her voice hitting a desperate, high-pitched frequency. "Lydia is a freelancer. She fixes printers." "She does. Tech support. You're talking about a world-class consultant. You're talking about a savior. You're embarrassing yourself." Julian didn't even look at her. His gaze was anchored to mine, filled with a terrifying clarity. "I'm not confused, Sarah. I spent 3 days on an encrypted bridge with a woman whose logic was so sharp it felt like a razor. I asked her why she wouldn't show her face, and she told me that a ghost has no ego to bruise." He turned toward the table, addressing my father and the stunned board members. "Last October, my firm was hit by a 0-day exploit. We were losing $300,000 every 10 minutes. Our internal team was paralyzed. The board was ready to declare bankruptcy." My father's face was a mask of disbelief. "You said you hired a firm from London, Julian. You said they were the best in Europe." I lied to the board because I didn't want them to know our fate was in the hands of a single, anonymous contractor, Julian countered, his voice booming now, echoing off the high ceilings. "I paid a $2 million emergency retainer. And this ghost didn't just stop the bleed. She reverse-engineered the attacker's own code, traced the source to a server farm in Volgograd, and locked them out of their own system. She saved my company. She saved your investment." He turned back to me, his voice trembling. "And all this time, I've been sitting at dinner with you, listening to Sarah talk about your little hobbies. I've watched you sit there in silence while your own family treated you like a failure. Why didn't you say anything?" "Because it wasn't my job to correct her," I said, my voice cutting through the tension with a cold, clinical precision. "I learned a long time ago that Sarah's world only has room for one person. If I had told you, she would have called me a liar. If I had shown you the bank statements, she would have said I was dabbling in things I didn't understand. I preferred the silence. It was cleaner." Sarah's facade didn't just crack, it began to disintegrate in real time. The golden child was trembling, her chest heaving as she realized that the hierarchy she had spent 27 years perfecting had been built on a foundation of air. She looked around at the guests, the investors, the socialites, the people she had spent the last hour impressing, and saw them looking at her with a new, sharp-edged pity. She wasn't the ambitious one anymore. She was the woman who was too blinded by her own vanity to realize her sister was the most powerful person in the room. "You did this on purpose," Sarah hissed, her eyes welling with tears of rage. "You waited for tonight. You waited for my engagement party to try and steal my life. I didn't steal anything, Sarah, I replied, standing up and smoothing the silk of my dress. I just stopped pretending to be the person you needed me to be. You built your life on the idea that I was small. That was your choice. I just built my life in the space you were too arrogant to look at. My mother finally found her voice, though it was weak and trembling. Lydia, all those times we asked if you needed help with rent, you were making millions? I didn't need your help, Mom. I needed your respect, I said, looking her in the eye for the first time in years. But you were too busy admiring the shine on Sarah's trophy to notice I was the one who bought the cabinet. Julian stepped away from Sarah entirely, walking toward the edge of the stage. He looked like a man who had just realized he was about to marry into a house of mirrors. The glass house was shivering, the structural integrity of the Moore family failing with every second of silence. The power hadn't just shifted, it had been reclaimed. I wasn't the quiet one, the reliable one, or the struggling one. I was the architect. And as I watched Sarah's world collapse around her, I realized that the only thing more satisfying than being invisible was finally being seen by the people who tried to bury me. The gala continued around us, but for our small circle, the music had died. Julian stood in the center of the wreckage, his gaze flickering between Sarah, who was still frantically trying to brush the red wine from her white lace dress, and me. The silence between them wasn't just a pause, it was the sound of a contract being shredded. Julian, please, Sarah whispered, her eyes red-rimmed as she finally gave up on the stain. She's my sister. We have a certain dynamic. It was just a joke. Everyone knows Lydia doesn't take things personally. Julian looked at her then, and for the first time, I saw the CEO who made the hard calls. His face was a mask of cold realization. A joke? He asked, his voice low and dangerous. I watched you stand on that stage and systematically strip her of her dignity to make yourself feel taller. I watched your parents nod along like it was a script they'd rehearsed for 20 years. He paused, shaking his head slowly. The person I hired to save my company was a titan. The person you described was a footnote. I can't unsee the difference now, Sarah. Sarah reached for his hand, her diamond ring flashing under the chandeliers, a ring paid for by a man who had only just realized he didn't know the woman wearing it. I was just trying to protect our image. I didn't think it mattered. It mattered to me, Julian interrupted, stepping back and letting her hand fall into the empty air. If you can treat your own blood like a convenient prop for your ego, what happens when I'm the one in your way? What happens when our legacy needs a scapegoat? The guests nearby began to whisper, their eyes darting toward the scene. The golden child was finally losing the room. My father tried to step in, his voice booming with a forced heartiness that fooled no one. Now, Julian. Let's not let a little misunderstanding ruin a beautiful night. Lydia's always been modest. We didn't know. You didn't know because you didn't want to know, Julian said, turning his fire on my father. It was easier to keep her in a box labeled failure, so you didn't have to deal with the fact that she's the most successful person in this family. You didn't lack information, Arthur. You lacked respect. I stood by the mahogany table, watching the dissolution of their carefully curated reality. I didn't feel the surge of petty joy I thought I would. Instead, I felt a profound sense of relief. The burden of the secret, the more tax I had paid in silence for a decade, was finally lifted. I didn't have to round the edges anymore. Julian turned back to me. The intensity in his eyes had shifted from shock to a deep, lingering shame. Lydia, I owe you more than just a retainer. I owe you an apology for sitting at your table and believing the lie. I thought I was marrying into a family of high achievers. I didn't realize I was marrying into a theater troupe. I don't need an apology, Julian, I said, my voice calm, the ghost finally speaking with the weight of the architect. I just needed the truth to be the loudest thing in the room for once. You see her now. That's enough. Sarah let out a choked sob, a sound of genuine panic as she saw the life she'd engineered slipping through her fingers. Julian, stay. We can talk about this. We can fix this. But Julian was already looking toward the exit. The glass house hadn't just shivered, the foundation had turned to dust. I don't think you can fix a marriage that started with a character assassination, Sarah. I need to go. I need to think about what else I've been blind to. He walked away, leaving Sarah standing in the center of the ballroom, a red-stained bride-to-be with no one left to impress. My parents moved toward her, their habits of a lifetime pulling them back into their roles as her protectors, but even they looked hollow. They looked at me, and for the first time, I saw fear in their eyes. They realized the quiet one was the only one who truly knew the architecture of their lives, and she was no longer interested in keeping the peace. I picked up my clutch and began to walk toward the door. I didn't look back at the ballroom or the golden child who was currently crumbling into the carpet. I had spent 27 years being a ghost in their house. It was time to go home and be the master of my own. The morning after the gala, my apartment felt different. The air was no longer thick with the phantom pressure of other people's expectations. I sat at my workstation, the command center of Aegis Digital, and watched the sunrise hit the sleek, high-end hardware I had spent years hiding from view. For the first time, I didn't feel the need to tuck the expensive scotch away or apologize for the sheer scale of the monitors. I wasn't Lydia, the struggling freelancer, anymore. I was simply Lydia. My phone had been vibrating since dawn. There were frantic texts from my mother about family unity, a dozen missed calls from my father, and a series of long, rambling voicemails from Sarah. I didn't delete them, but I didn't listen to them either. For 10 years, I had been the one responding to their crises, the one smoothing over the awkwardness of my own existence. I was done being the family's unpaid emotional architect. A week later, I agreed to meet Sarah. We sat in a quiet corner of a cafe far from the country club circles she frequented. She looked different, the polished, impressive veneer had cracked. Her hair wasn't perfectly coiffed, and the diamond ring was gone. Julian hadn't just walked out of the ballroom, he had walked out of the engagement. "He won't take my calls," she said, her voice sounding hollow, devoid of its usual performative spark. She looked at me, searching for the quiet one she could blame for her misfortune. "You knew what would happen, didn't you? You wanted to humiliate me." I looked at her, and for the first time, I didn't soften my gaze. I didn't round the edges of my words to protect her ego. I didn't want anything, Sarah. I just stopped lying for you. If the truth humiliated you, then your life was a lie to begin with. I was just trying to be someone, she snapped, a flicker of the old fire returning. I had to be the best. I had to be the one who mattered. You were always so content with nothing. I wasn't content with nothing, I said, my voice cold and clear. I was building an empire while you were building a stage. You were so busy making sure I looked small that you forgot to check if I actually was. I don't owe you a smaller version of myself just so you can feel tall. I never did. She stared at me, seeing the architect for the first time without the filter of her own narcissism. There was no more mocking laughter, no more patronizing little sister comments. Just the realization that she had been competing with a shadow, while the real person was miles ahead of her. I stood up to leave, placing a bill on the table that covered both our coffees. It was a small gesture, but it felt like the final closure of a very old account. My parents had started sending tentative emails, asking about my work, actually waiting for the answers. They were learning, slowly and clumsily, that the labels they had pinned on me were scrap paper. I used to think that staying quiet was a form of kindness, that by hiding my growth, I was keeping the peace. I was wrong. Silence isn't kindness. It's a slow-acting poison that teaches people it's okay to overlook you. It doesn't protect the family. It just protects the lie. As I walked out into the bright afternoon sun, I felt a profound sense of lightness. The ghost had finally taken up space. I had spent 27 years shrinking, editing my brilliance, and apologizing for my success. But as I headed back to the empire I had built with my own two hands, I realized that the world is big enough for everyone to shine. But if someone tells you to dim your light so they can feel bright, They aren't your family. They're just afraid of the dark. I wasn't a footnote in Sarah's story. I was the author of my own. And from now on, I would be writing in bold.